Imagine stepping into a time machine.
Always a fun place to start.
Right, so you go back to the year 1997, and you lock $100 in a secure, impenetrable vault.
Okay.
Or, if you were in South Korea, you put an equivalent amount of Korean won into that exact same vault. You close the heavy steel door, you spin the dial, and you just walk away.
And let me guess, you open it today.
Exactly. Fast forward to today, you open that vault. The physical paper is still sitting right there, completely untouched.
But the value isn't.
Not even close. According to a really staggering piece of data in the intelligence briefing we're looking at today, specifically, Table 3 of the document that Korean won has lost 71.1% of its purchasing power.
Wow.
And the U.S. dollar, it has dropped by 69.3%.
That is massive.
Right. You didn't spend a single dime, your physical security was flawless, yet more than 2/3 of your actual wealth simply evaporated into thin air.
It's a harsh reality check.
It really is. So welcome to the deep dive.
Uh-huh.
Today we are exploring a highly strategic, intensely data-driven financial intelligence report focused on a concept the authors call physical determinism and the defense of digital assets.
Yeah, and the mission of this deep dive is to sort of deconstruct the core and, frankly, quite aggressive argument of this text.
Which is?
That relying on political consensus to protect your wealth is a fundamental trap, and that only physical laws forged by the actual consumption of energy can truly secure a digital asset.
Yeah, the source material frames that massive loss in purchasing power, not just as, standard macroeconomic inflation, but as a deliberate and systematic deletion of labor.
Because the thermodynamic cost for a central authority to print fiat currency is absolutely zero.
Zero.
It is a profound and honestly unsettling premise. To really grasp the mechanics of what the authors are arguing here, we have to stay in that year, 1997.
Right, we aren't looking at Wall Street.
No, and we aren't looking at the policy decisions of central banks to understand this shift in asset defense. Instead, the briefing points us toward a cypherpunk named Adam Back.
Okay.
The text makes a really crucial distinction here. While other pioneers and cryptographers in the early digital space were heavily focused on the legal mechanics of anonymous contracts or how to design distributed ledgers.
Adam Back was looking at something entirely different.
Exactly. He was focused on the physical universe. Specifically, he was looking at the second law of thermodynamics.
Okay, let's unpack this because it's so easy to forget that the structural vulnerability of the 1990s internet wasn't just a lack of bandwidth, it was the absolute absence of friction.
Right, there was no mass.
Yeah, sending a packet of data like an email cost essentially zero energy and zero money. And this lack of physical cost practically invited the massive waves of spam and denial of service attacks that nearly choked the early web to death.
The intelligence briefing actually describes this period as a digital flood.
It was an economic asymmetry. A single bad actor with one computer could send millions of requests and completely paralyze global communication networks.
Because freedom without a physical cost was actively destroying the usability of the system.
That economic asymmetry is the entire crux of the problem.
Yeah, when the cost of an action is zero, there is absolutely no barrier to abuse.
And the cypherpunks, this loosely organized group of privacy advocates and brilliant cryptographers, they desperately wanted the freedom of anonymous open communication.
But they were running headfirst into a paradox. This very freedom was generating indiscriminate data waste. It wasn't just a nuisance, it was a foundational structural flaw in how networks operated. If you didn't have to pay to play, you could break the board.
And this is where Adam Back steps in with a question that the briefing frames as genuinely revolutionary. He looks at this digital flood and asks, how can we impose a physical cost on digital data that is fundamentally free?
And his answer to this was a system he called Hashcash.
Right. He proposed a protocol where, before you could send an email, your computer's CPU had to solve a complex mathematical puzzle.
It wasn't a puzzle a human would sit down and solve. It was a cryptographic puzzle that would take your computer about 1 or 2 seconds of processing power to crack.
He originally categorized this as a proof of time. Right.
Yeah, though the broader concept is what we now universally recognize as proof of work. You are forcing the physical machine to do verifiable work before granting it access to the network.
The analogy the report uses to explain this is perfect. It's like attaching a physical postage stamp to a digital envelope.
That's a great way to visualize it.
If you want to send physical mail through the postal service, you have to buy a stamp. That stamp proves to the network that you paid a cost, which inherently stops people from sending millions of physical junk letters. It would bankrupt them.
Exactly. Back created a digital postage stamp, but instead of paying for it with fiat paper money, you paid for it with computing cycles.
You paid for it with electricity.
And we really have to view this innovation through the geopolitical lens of the era. The briefing reminds us that this was during the height of the crypto wars.
Oh, right.
At that time, the United States government classified strong encryption software as literal munitions. They treated mathematical code like weapons-grade material and restricted its export across borders.
Wild to think about that now.
It is, and Adam Back was deeply embedded in this ideological fight for freedom of expression. He famously crossed international borders wearing a T-shirt printed with RSA encryption code just to protest these absurd restrictions.
So Hashcash wasn't just designed to be a quirky anti-spam tool for your inbox.
No, as the source text points out, it was the physical embodiment of digital anarchism. It was a purely mathematical way to maintain order and prevent network abuse without needing a centralized censor, a corporation, or a government authority to police the triode.
But surely the academic and technical communities of the late 90s didn't just embrace this, right? I mean, the entire driving force of computer science is efficiency, making things faster, cheaper, using less energy.
Yeah, suggesting that a computer should intentionally burn power to solve a puzzle seems completely counterintuitive to the ethos of Silicon Valley.
What's fascinating here is exactly that pushback. The technical academia and early internet users openly mocked the concept.
The briefing notes that they called it crazy to intentionally waste precious computing power on finding essentially meaningless numbers.
It went against everything taught in computer science departments. But Back stood his ground because he understood a profound mathematical truth that his critics missed.
Which was?
The process of finding a specific hash value through sheer brute force random trials was, mathematically speaking, identical to mining for gold in the physical world. He was simulating physical scarcity in a realm of infinite replication.
It is a brilliant conceptual leap.
It is. But the briefing also highlights a massive flaw in Back's 1997 engine. It lacked a difficulty adjustment.
Ah, because of Moore's law.
Right. We know that computing power scales exponentially, so if the puzzles remain static, as new hardware hit the market, those cryptographic puzzles would become trivially easy to solve.
The cost of that digital stamp would drop right back down to near zero.
Exactly, causing a sort of digital hyperinflation. The friction would disappear again. The text notes it took 12 years for someone to fix that specific flaw, and that someone was Satoshi Nakamoto, the pseudonymous creator of Bitcoin.
So Satoshi took Back's foundational engine, the concept of requiring thermodynamic work, and placed it at the very heart of a new global financial network, effectively solving the digital inflation problem Back's original model faced.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the intelligence briefing we're analyzing provides what it calls clinical proof of this evolution. It maps Hashcash directly onto Bitcoin's proof of work.
Arguing that it's a one-to-one mathematical inheritance?
Yeah. So we know Satoshi fixed the difficulty problem, but the briefing spends a lot of time on something called a partial hash collision. How does that actually map to what Back was doing? Is it just conceptual inspiration?
The authors argue it is much more than mere inspiration. It is literal mathematical DNA. I'll break down the math they present, keeping it focused on the mechanics.
Sounds good.
The core of Hashcash involves taking data, like an email header, and running it through a cryptographic hash function alongside a random number called a nonce.
Okay.
The objective is to keep guessing that random number until the output of the hash function starts with a predetermined number of leading 0 bits.
Meaning the hash of the data combined with the nonce equals 0, 0, 0, and so on.
Precisely. Finding an output with those specific leading zeros requires millions of random guesses. The briefing points out that Bitcoin appropriated this exact partial hash collision mechanism.
To mine a block of Bitcoin and secure the decentralized ledger, your computer has to find a hash with a specific number of leading zeros. The structural methodology is identical.
And the briefing outlines how Satoshi addressed the hyperinflation flaw with what they call a global dynamic equilibrium.
This is the adjustable difficulty algorithm. The formula they provide is beautifully elegant. The new target equals the old target, multiplied by the actual time it took to mine the last 2016 blocks, all divided by 20,160 minutes.
Right, assuming the audience knows that the network aims for a 10-minute block time, meaning 2016 blocks should take exactly 2 weeks. This formula acts as an automatic thermostat.
If the global hash rate increases and computers solve the puzzles too fast, the formula automatically decreases the target value, making the puzzle harder.
It brilliantly transforms Beck's static idea of computational expenditure into a globally responsive, self-regulating ecosystem.
It creates a closed loop of absolute physical determinism. But to answer your earlier question about whether this is just conceptual, the intelligence briefing gets incredibly granular here. They point to a specific file within the actual Bitcoin Core source code.
The src/pow.cpp.ft file.
Yes, if you examine that file, there's a function called check proof of work. The briefing highlights that this specific function shares the exact same mathematical structure and validation logic as the value function in Back's original Hashcash code.
So Adam Back's 1997 command to attach a stamp in digital space literally became Satoshi's structural command to mine digital gold. The underlying code is the same engine,
which acts as the perfect bridge point in this briefing.
Because the authors explicitly pivot here from the history of cryptography into modern, aggressive strategic defense.
Exactly. The text argues that while the general public and mainstream media are constantly distracted by narratives about energy waste, the global elite and institutional strategists are quietly looking at the math of what the report calls a digital citadel.
And the data defining that citadel is staggering.
Since 2009, computing power has grown by roughly 2 million-fold. But because of that dynamic equilibrium we just discussed, the network hasn't become 2 million times easier to hack.
By 2026, the report projects the network's hash rate, the total combined computing power securing the ledger, will exceed 800 exahashes per second.
To put 800 exahashes per second into perspective, that is a nearly unfathomable deployment of physical infrastructure, silicon, and electricity dedicated globally to solving these specific thermodynamic puzzles.
The data proves a vital strategic point. In this specific mathematical system, technological advancement and the proliferation of hardware do not weaken the fortress.
They make it exponentially stronger.
The cost to attack the network scales directly with human technological progress.
And the briefing draws a very stark contrast between this energy-secured fortress and the digital alternatives currently being pushed in global finance.
It's important to remind you, the listener, right here, that we are objectively reporting the perspective of the source material.
Yes, very important.
Because they use highly provocative, uncompromising language to describe financial systems that do not rely on proof of work. Specifically, the authors target proof-of-stake systems and central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs.
They outline what they explicitly title an asset destruction scenario.
If we connect this to the bigger picture the authors are painting, they view CBDCs not simply as a modernization of money, but as highly sophisticated programmable control tools.
In a centralized digital system that lacks the physical energy barrier designed by Adam Back, the briefing argues that governments could freeze the accounts of individuals who oppose specific state policies with a few simple keystrokes.
They could geographically restrict where you spend your money or put expiration dates on your savings to force economic stimulation.
The source text claims that in such a centralized architecture, your wealth ceases to be an inherent property right and degrades into a conditioned right.
A conditioned right entirely dependent on your ongoing compliance with the issuing authority.
And the authors take it a step further, tying it back to the systematic deletion of labor we discussed at the very beginning. Because CBDCs and fiat currencies can be generated endlessly at zero cost, the briefing argues they systematically loop purchasing power through deliberate inflation.
They effectively translate the fruits of your lifelong physical labor into what the text bluntly calls free data.
It's a heavy, highly critical concept. While proof of work protects asset value by constantly burning physical energy, fiat systems maintain their structure by quietly burning your time.
The unrecoverable time you spent working for a currency that is intentionally designed to devalue.
The authors are equally harsh in their assessment of proof-of-stake consensus mechanisms. The briefing describes POS as inherently creating a money breeds money structure.
Right, because validation power and network rewards are distributed based on how much capital a user already holds. So those with the most capital naturally consolidate the most decision-making power over the network's future.
The authors view this as a catastrophic historical regression. They claim it leads directly to the formation of digital gulags,
effectively surrendering all authority right back to the very traditional, trusted third parties that cypherpunks like Adam Back were trying to dismantle in the 90s.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? The text is essentially presenting a brutal binary ultimatum.
You are choosing between two very different realities.
On one hand, you have a system that demands the continuous, massive burning of real-world energy to protect and cryptographically prove the value of an asset. On the other hand, you have a system that demands you burn your own labor to stay afloat in a pool of endlessly printed currency, managed by a centralized political authority.
But surely the environmentalists have a point when we were talking about the energy consumption of entire countries like Argentina or Switzerland. Doesn't this reliance on physical mass come with massive geopolitical and environmental baggage?
As data analysts, the authors of the briefing insist on a cold verification of their own thesis. They acknowledge that relying on physical mass is indeed a double-edged sword.
And they rigorously dissect two massive counter-arguments to the proof-of-work model. The first is exactly what you mentioned, the energy waste theory.
Bitcoin is frequently labeled a climate disaster, especially when mining operations utilize fossil fuels to power their hashing arrays. How does the briefing counter the reality of that massive carbon footprint?
The report counters this by citing Adam Back's own economic defense of the network. Back argues that Bitcoin is actually the most honest and transparent energy buyer on the planet.
He frames the network mathematically as a consumer of last resort.
Because miners are completely location agnostic, they only need an internet connection. They can set up massive hardware arrays directly next to stranded or surplus energy sources.
This is power generated by remote waterfalls, capped natural gas flares, or off-peak wind farms that would otherwise go completely to waste because it cannot be economically transported to distant urban centers.
By acting as a guaranteed buyer for this surplus power, the argument goes, Bitcoin mining can actually provide the baseline monetization required to make new renewable energy projects economically viable that otherwise would never receive funding.
Okay, even if we accept the stranded energy economic model, what about the hardware itself? The intelligence briefing notes a massive centralization happening on the physical equipment side.
Yeah, the cypherpunk dream of the 90s was one CPU, one vote, where anyone with a laptop could participate in securing the network.
But that's entirely dead, isn't it? Today, mining is completely dominated by massive, capital-intensive data centers using highly specialized hardware called ASICs.
The network demands so much energy and specialized computing power that it has effectively priced the everyday person out of the consensus process.
This raises an important question, and it is the second major flaw the authors address: ASIC centralization. This concentration of mining power among a few well-funded, publicly traded entities creates a deep structural threat to the network.
If a small group of large mining pools were to collude or be coerced by a state actor to control more than 50% of the network's hash rate, they could execute a 51% attack.
And in practice, a 51% attack means they could selectively censor specific users, block transactions, or reorganize the recent ledger history, right?
Yeah.
It essentially breaks the immutability of the chain.
Precisely. The briefing warns that the decentralized network of individuals risks slowly morphing into a centralized fortress of institutional capitalists.
And this is the ultimate paradox of physical determinism. The fundamental inefficiency of requiring massive energy and hardware input is Bitcoin's greatest security shield. It makes it prohibitively expensive for a foreign state to attack the network.
But it is simultaneously its political Achilles heel, as it naturally tends toward the centralization of the very physical assets required to maintain the decentralized code.
It's a fascinating paradox. The very thing that mathematically secures the network is the exact thing that makes it vulnerable to both intense environmental criticism and corporate centralization. Let's synthesize all of the data we've covered today.
The core thesis of this highly clinical, uncompromising intelligence briefing is that heading into modern capital markets without fundamentally understanding the thermodynamic mechanics of Hashcash is like sailing into a Category 5 hurricane on a ship that has no engine.
The text argues that if your assets rely entirely on human promises, political consensus, or the shifting goodwill of a central bank, rather than indisputable physical laws, their value will eventually and inevitably vanish.
The source text leaves the reader with a final, unyielding choice. Will you choose to pay a thermodynamic cost, meaning the ongoing expenditure of physical energy and silicon hardware, in exchange for absolute, mathematically verifiable ownership of your assets?
Or will you accept central control, with all its inherent potential for asset freezing, censorship, and silent inflation, simply for the sake of convenience and environmental optics?
The underlying philosophy of the briefing is stark. Human political systems negotiate. Thermodynamics do not.
It is a heavy, intense perspective on the intersection of physical reality and digital finance. And it brings up a provocative thought that I want to leave you with today, something for you to ponder that builds on the foundation of this briefing, but wasn't explicitly covered by the authors.
What's that?
If we are rapidly moving toward a future where the only undeniable, unfakeable truth in the digital world must be proven by consuming massive amounts of physical electricity, if cryptographic code and energy expenditure are the only things we can truly trust to hold value, what happens to the value of human intellect?
Yeah, that is a huge question.
What happens to human memory, or the nuanced physical labor of a master carpenter, or the empathy of a caregiver? Things that fundamentally cannot be digitized, hashed, and run through an ASIC miner. If this concept of physical determinism plays out to its absolute logical extreme across global markets, will the only things considered truly real and valuable in the future be the things that leave a measurable thermodynamic carbon footprint?
It's a profound and slightly terrifying question to consider as we watch the digital and physical worlds increasingly collide.
It really is. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the consensus, keep looking at the data, and we will catch you next time.